Hello. Welcome once again to the Fair Minded Christian YouTube channel. I'm your host, Stephen. Today is part 5 of our series called Trinity, Believe It or Not? Trinity, Believe It or Else. Today's question is, why do most Christians accept the Trinity doctrine? Let's get started. Now, there are several reasons as to why the Trinity doctrine is accepted at face value by most Christians, without any type of protest or investigation into its biblical validity. The primary reason is due largely to the official church creeds of the Catholic Church in the 3rd and 4th centuries, which were eventually adopted into the official church doctrinal statements that we see today in the vast majority of Catholic, Orthodox, and Protestant denominations. All of these statements require that the doctrine of the Trinity be universally accepted, or else. Now, if you think about it, this is a classic example of the emperor has no clothes, if you remember the popular childhood story. Out of fear of being ostracized from their churches, their religious social groups, or even labeled as some type of heretic, cultist, or a non-believer, the majority of Christians over the years have learned to simply go along to get along, as they say. They would rather follow along in compliance instead of questioning the beliefs of their church leaders, or should I call them their church emperors. They do this in spite of the blatant contradictions inherent in the Trinity doctrine when compared to the actual words of the Bible. A secondary reason the Trinity doctrine is so widely accepted is that most Christians have been conditioned to leave the responsibility of knowing the true meaning of their faith biblically to their church leaders. Instead of studying the Bible for themselves, they simply rely on what they consider to be the paid experts, such as their pastors, priests, or other religious leaders. This is very similar to what most people do with regards to their medical doctors when it comes to their health. Just leave it up to the experts, and we can simply rely and trust on what they tell us, many conclude. However, the Bible instructs us to be knowledgeable in regards to our faith. How else will we know if someone is misleading us unless we take the time to learn for ourselves? The same is true with our personal health. How will we know if the doctor is recommending to us good things unless we proactively take steps to learn our own body and what it needs and what it doesn't need? When we fail to practice the basic discipline of studying the Bible for ourselves, we ultimately stunt our spiritual growth and remain in a type of perpetual state of spiritual immaturity. And those who are spiritually immature, like babies, need someone else to feed them. This is how the Bible addresses this subject. In Hosea chapter 4, verse 6, we read, "My people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. Because you have rejected knowledge, I also will reject you from being priests for me." And in Acts chapter 17, verse 10 through 11, we have, "Then the brethren immediately sent Paul and Silas away by night to Berea. When they arrived, they went into the synagogue of the Jews. These were more fair-minded than those in Thessalonica, in that they received the word with all readiness and searched the scriptures daily to find out whether these things were so." And in 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 15, we have, "Study to show thyself approved unto God, a workman that needed not to be ashamed, rightly dividing the word of truth." And lastly, in Hebrews chapter 5, verse 12 through 14, we have, "For though by this time you ought to be teachers, you need someone to teach you again the first principles of the oracles of God. You have come to need milk and not solid food. For everyone who partakes only of milk is unskilled in the word of righteousness, for he is a babe. But solid food belongs to those who are of full age, that is, those who by reason of use have their senses exercised to discern both good and evil. Now, the final reason most Christians blindly accept the Trinity doctrine is due to the wording of the King James Version of the Bible, which is by far the most popular English Bible. In it are a few key verses that appear to suggest that Jesus is God and therefore God is a Trinity. Now, a key point to keep in mind regarding the King James Version is that historically speaking, when it was created, it was labeled the authorized Bible of the entire English-speaking world in the 1600s. This was done by edict of King James VI. Therefore, the translators who created it had to follow very strict guidelines, some of which included translating words in a certain way to indicate elements of the Trinity or inserting entire verses that are not at all mentioned in the original Greek manuscripts. A few examples of this in the King James Bible are 1 Timothy chapter 3 verse 16, 1 John chapter 5 verse 7, and Revelation chapter 1 verse 11. When comparing these verses in other English translations such as the New International Version or the English Standard Version, you will notice that the wording is quite different, meaning that only when reading it in the King James Version does it suggest that Jesus is God, which is the foundation of the Trinity. And there are several more examples that I could provide, which is quite an interesting fun fact. Now, this leads us to our next question, which we'll cover in part 6 of Trinity, Believe It or Not, Trinity, Believe It or Else.